It's my pleasure to start with the second session of our symposium. Just a very short note before starting, actually. We have quite a number of people who move to online. That's fine by us, but just then do participate. So I'm addressing to people on Zoom, especially. Do not hesitate to raise and have questions on Zoom, and we will try to bring them on stage for you, so please do. This second session is has a title which is Emergence of Diversity, which is very broad, very fuzzy somehow, and it has been actually evolving. So I'm not sure if we are talking so much of emergence or attitude toward diversity or influence of diversity on the brain, on the minds. But in any case, it will be very interesting to see the perspective of three different and excellent speakers we have today, starting with Emily Toner, who will speak about social connection and the adolescent brain in a neuroimaging, neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience perspective. Mark Alassanière-Tang, who will explore the diversity of language through the interaction of evolution between grammatical gender and sociocultural gender, which will echo the very last question of our previous roundtable. And we'll close with André Simpian, who will talk about the developmental aspects and roots of gender gaps in science and engineering, which will make a very smooth transition to the next session, which will occur this afternoon. So I will first introduce you our first speaker, Emily Toner. She's in the final year PhD candidate in psychology at the University of Cambridge and at Gates Cambridge Scholar in the Developmental Cognitive Neuroscience Lab led by Professor Sarah J. Blakemore. And PhD research focused primarily on social isolation in adolescence, where she investigates the effects of isolation and loneliness on fear learning, mental health through the use of high-resolution magnetic resonance imaging. Her talk is entitled Social Cognition, Connection, and the Adolescent Brain. So I invite you to join me on stage, Emily, and give a round of applause to her, please.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me and for the really great talks this morning. They were super interesting. So I'm going to be talking about social connection and the adolescent brain, so taking a little bit of a different perspective on inclusion, but I hope you'll find it interesting. So social interactions are proposed to be a really basic human need, so analogous to other fundamental needs like food consumption and sleep. And researchers have proposed the idea that just like hunger can prompt you to eat or tiredness can prompt you to sleep, social isolation and the consequent feelings of loneliness you experience from being alone might create this kind of motivational state or a craving for social interactions. But how do we know if this social craving really involves the same kind of neural mechanisms as our physiological craving for food or for rest? So my colleague and my co-PhD supervisor, who I'm actually replacing in this talk today, Dr. Olivia Tomova, sought to test this empirically by conducting a novel experiment on social isolation in humans. So she had participants come into the lab for brain scans after different experiences. So in one condition, participants went through 10 hours of social isolation, and in another condition, they didn't eat for 10 hours, so a fasting condition. And she compared the patterns of brain activation from each condition and found that midbrain regions showed selective responses to food cues after fasting and to social cues after isolation. So in other words, the specific parts of our brain's reward system light up when we're hungry and see food, and those same patterns are activated when we've been alone and we see images of friends or loved ones. And these results kind of support the intuitive idea that acute isolation causes social craving, similar to the way fasting causes hunger. And I think that can be really adaptive in the short term, motivating us to reach out and socialize. But what about when isolation is chronic or loneliness is really long-term? So feeling insufficiently connected to others in the long term is associated with profound and lasting negative consequences to physical and mental health. So across the lifespan, people who are chronically lonely experience more depressive and anxiety symptoms, have lower self-esteem, report more suicidal behaviors, sleep problems, and cardiovascular incidents, go to the doctor more often, and have a substantially higher risk for early mortality. And unfortunately, social isolation and loneliness are growing issues worldwide. So surveys indicate that loneliness levels are especially high among 16 to 24-year-olds, surpassing all other age groups in many countries. And though loneliness was worsened by the COVID pandemic, it does not seem to be solely caused by it. So loneliness has been worsening in young adults aged 18 to 29 for some time, and according to a meta-analysis of 345 studies, and there's similar trends observed in adolescents aged 13 to 18 years. And this is really worrying because adolescence, or the period which we call between 10 to 24 years of age, typically constitutes a period of social reorientation in which social connections become increasingly important. And peer interactions are a really vital aspect of adolescent development. So compared with children, adolescents spend more time with peers than with their family and form more complex peer relationships. The importance of obtaining peer social approval increases, and peer influence is heightened during this period. And so adolescents are more sensitive to peer acceptance, rejection, and approval than either children or adults. And thanks to advances in neuroimaging, we now know that in addition to being a time of really profound social and psychological transformation, adolescence is also a time of heightened neuroplasticity and brain development. Further, regions involved in this social brain network undergo substantial development throughout adolescence. And this network is thought to give us the ability to understand other people's feelings, relate to them, and build really meaningful social relationships. So given the widespread and really protracted neural, social, and psychological changes during this period, it's now thought that adolescence constitutes a sensitive period, potentially for social and emotional development. So in other words, this might be a developmental period of both heightened opportunity, but also vulnerability to environmental input and experience. And I think this raises an important question about whether adolescents might be particularly sensitive to the effects of social isolation and loneliness, like I showed you in the previous study that was done in adults. And this question has typically been studied experimentally in animal models. So rodents are often chosen because they're social animals and they go through similar developmental stages as humans. So for example, just like humans, adolescent rodents show a strong orientation towards their peers. And social isolation has been shown to cause substantial changes in brain and behavior in adolescent rodents, especially if this isolation occurs during development. And even brief social isolation in adolescent rodents can evoke widespread structural and functional changes in their brain. And important, some of these effects are really specific to isolation during rodent adolescence and do not occur to a similar extent when the isolation occurs either before or after the adolescent period. And then behaviorally, isolation in adolescent rodents also leads to increased anxiety behaviors, hyperactivity, and heightened sensitivity to social rewards, which could extend to the seeking of food or drug rewards, which might make these animals particularly prone to develop reward-seeking behaviors that we might classify as sort of like addiction behaviors in humans. So my colleagues and I sought to test these same questions in adolescent humans. So to address this question, we employed experimental short-term isolation in adolescents aged 16 to 19 years. And to do this, we brought in 40 adolescent participants to our lab after a normal day, where they proceeded to have a 7T brain scan and then perform some experimental tasks. And on another day, they spent 3 to 4 hours alone in an experimental isolation room before completing the same tasks. And then finally, we did one more session where participants again spent 3 to 4 hours alone in an isolation room, but this time they were allowed access to virtual social interactions. So they were able to make calls, use their laptops and phones to access social media. And so after isolation, participants demonstrated increased loneliness compared to baseline, with greater increases after the session of total isolation compared to the session where they had this access to virtual social interactions. And then with regard to our primary research questions, we found that isolation was associated with faster decisions to exert effort for rewards and higher reward learning, especially when this was from social feedback. We found that adolescents with lower baseline neural reward sensitivity exhibited increased reward seeking post-isolation, meaning that this neural reward responsiveness might be a potential marker for how an individual will react to the stress of isolation. And we also found that isolation led to increased threat learning, which is a mechanism underlying the emergence, maintenance, and also the treatment of anxiety and other threat-related conditions like phobias, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And further, the effects we found in this study were stronger in participants who reported higher levels of loneliness following isolation. So this kind of further supports this idea that maybe these feelings of loneliness are driving some of these effects. So we know that isolation seems to cause increased loneliness, which can be associated with a host of these negative physical and psychological consequences. But I think what's perhaps striking is that even less drastic forms of social exclusion can have profound effects on adolescent well-being too. And there's this really classic task that has been used to study social exclusion known as cyberball. So in this task, participants are told that they are playing a computer game with other participants who are taking part in another room. And the participant is the player at the bottom of this diagram, so player 2, and they're tossing a ball back and forth to 2 other players. And the participant can kind of choose who to throw it to each time it's their turn. But what they don't know is that they're not actually playing this computer game with another participant, but instead this task is programmed to either include or exclude them from the ball tosses. So in one condition, participants are left out or socially excluded. And then researchers had participants report their mood at baseline, and then after a condition of the game where they were always included and one where they were always eventually excluded. And what you see here are age groups plotted on the x-axis, so young adolescents aged 11 to 14 on the left, mid-adolescents 14 to 16 in the middle, and adults aged 22 to 47 on the right. And on the y-axis, you can see their report of overall mood. So the solid bars are baseline, the dotted bars are inclusion, and the diagonally lined bars are after social exclusion. And so mood decreased after being excluded for all age groups, but these decreases were significantly larger for both young adolescents and mid-adolescents compared to adults. And this might suggest that adolescents are really hypersensitive to social exclusion. So being excluded from a social situation, even one that's as artificial as this cyberball computer game, had a really outsized influence on young people's mood. And this didn't just happen in one study. So this paradigm has been used repeatedly, and many studies have replicated the finding of decreased mood after social exclusion in adolescence. And then extending this work, other studies have found increases in anxiety and declines in cognitive processing, such as working memory performance and self-regulation, following even a single episode of social exclusion using the cyberball task in adolescent participants. So perhaps unsurprisingly, adolescence is a period of heightened vulnerability to mental health problems. So 75% of adults who have ever had a mental health condition report that they first experienced symptoms before the age of 24. And in the 10 years leading up to the pandemic, feelings of persistent sadness and hopelessness, as well as suicidal thoughts and behaviors, increased by about 40% in the US among young people, according to the CDC. And similar findings in England, with over 2 in 5 reporting elevated psychological distress in 2022, which was 35, which was 9 percentage points higher than the 35% in 2017, and 21 percentage points higher than those at the same age in 2007. And there's also similar findings for other countries in North America, Europe, and Asia, with many calling it, especially in the media, a kind of youth mental health crisis. But there's now substantial evidence that the social environment can really play a big part in adolescent mental health. And there is strong evidence that problems with peer relationships, peer rejection, bullying, and loneliness are risk factors for conditions like depression. And then conversely, to kind of look on the positive side, high-quality peer relationships can seem to be protective and strengthen resilience in some cases. So adolescents have reported better health at times when they felt more included, and a recent systematic review evaluated intervention studies, which aimed to prevent or treat adolescent depression by promoting social inclusion. And their results strongly suggest that this could be an important component of programs to promote adolescent mental health. And social support might even be more critical for those who have experienced early adversities like poverty, abuse, or neglect. So the detrimental impact of early life adversity on the developing brain has been really well established, and it seems to suggest that it systematically might alter these kind of critical neurocognitive systems that might increase vulnerability to mental health problems. But studies have shown that adolescence is a period in which social support can act to kind of recalibrate some aspects of the stress response system. And not only peers, but also caregivers can also help to provide some of this support. So indeed, sensitivity to supportive caregiving has been shown to be heightened and associated with better mental health, even for these adolescents who experienced intense psychosocial stress during childhood. So for example, in a study using data from the Bucharest Early Intervention Project, researchers examined children who were subjected to severe neglect in the form of institutional care in Romania before being adopted into foster care, and this started in the 1990s. And so on the right, you can see the stress hormone trajectories of a comparison group of healthy, typically developing adolescents across a variety of pubertal stages. So the bluer the lines, the more advanced the stage of puberty. And on the left, you can see the stress hormone trajectories of the previously institutionalized group. And what you can see is that in early puberty, so the greener lines towards the bottom, their stress response was quite different to the healthy comparison group. However, at more advanced stages of puberty, this kind of normalized, looking pretty much indistinguishable from the healthy comparison group. And I think important to note that this is despite these children being adopted at 2 years of age. So humans exposed to deprived institutional care in infancy show reduced HPA responsivity, the stress response, even years after they're placed in these supportive, well-resourced families. But this research is kind of suggesting that adolescence might provide a chance for recalibration of the stress system. And this also might suggest that intervention efforts to improve outcomes for children who have experienced these early life adversities should focus on this kind of adolescent prepubertal and peripubertal period in order to kind of maximize their impact. So in other words, it might be possible to reverse some of these lasting effects of even these really extreme early life social deprivation during adolescence. So at this point, you might be wondering, what kind of role do technologies like social media play in adolescent sense of belonging? So paradoxically, while adolescents report some of the highest levels of loneliness, they also report more social media use than other age groups. And it's been proposed that the increase in loneliness among young people in recent years might even be due to the rise of digital media use and the, at the same time, decline in these in-person social interactions. But the empirical evidence remains inconclusive about whether social media use alleviates or exacerbates loneliness, as virtual social interactions can also enhance existing relationships, and foster new supportive connections. And social media can be especially beneficial for many young people, offering this kind of community and this way to connect with people who have similar interests and backgrounds. And these can lead to positive interactions also offline, and also with a more diverse range of peers than they might have immediate access to. And the social support is vital for often marginalized groups, such as racial, ethnic, sexual, and gender minorities. So, for instance, research indicates that social media can bolster the mental health of LGBTQIA+ youth by facilitating peer connections, exploring identity, and social support. And additionally, 7 in 10 adolescent girls of color have found uplifting content related to their race on social media. And a significant number of teenagers report that social media makes them feel more accepted, supported during kind of difficult times, able to express their creativity, and keeps them connected to their friends. And it also suggests that digital mental health tools, like some of those on social media, might encourage children and adolescents to seek help and may lead them to initiate mental health care. However, there's also a lot of evidence for the negative impacts of social media during adolescence. So, for example, a longitudinal cohort study of over 6,000 US adolescents aged 12 to 15 that adjusted for baseline mental health status found that adolescents who spent more than 3 hours a day on social media faced double the risk of experiencing poor mental health outcomes, including depression and anxiety. And then further, in our experimental study that I told you about earlier, we found that in that separate session where participants underwent the acute isolation, but did have access to virtual social interactions like social media, this access did not at all remediate the effects of isolation on threat learning, and the effects on reward learning were only partially remediated. So there remains many kind of unanswered questions regarding how best to use digital technologies to foster instead of undermine adolescents' sense of belonging. But I think this line of research promises to uncover many new things in the years ahead that can inform policy. So then finally, before I wrap up, I just wanted to highlight a final point about adolescence and the development of self-identity. So adolescence is an important time for building a sense of who you are, what you want to achieve, what motivates you, and how you feel about yourself and others. And it's a crucial stage for many aspects of developing the self, including commitments, personal goals, motivations, and psychosocial well-being. And adolescents also frequently report greater self-consciousness and are more concerned with and interested in others' perceptions of themselves. So I think to really truly realize the power of inclusion in science and to promote individuality and diversity, creativity and productivity, fostering this inclusion during this period is really essential. In a recent study, researchers investigated whether feeling included in an informal science program affected adolescents' sense of belonging. And so this included a diverse group of teens participating in STEM programs in the US and the UK. And they were tracked over 3 points in time. So at the start of the program, 3 months in, and then 12 months in. And these were the key findings. So at the beginning, adolescents only felt a strong sense of belonging if they felt included based on their social identity, including things like gender and ethnicity. And this study reveals that making teens feel included isn't really just about their happiness today, although that's really important. It's about really kind of shaping the future of science for tomorrow. So by fostering this kind of sense of belonging in STEM, we might be able to capitalize on the power of social inclusion and social salience during this developmental stage. And we can inspire more teens from underrepresented groups to pursue science careers, which is really essential for building this diverse and innovative community. So in conclusion, social connection is a really fundamental human need, and science increasingly demonstrates the really profound consequences of isolation, loneliness, and exclusion on our brains and our well-being and our identity. However, the remarkable plasticity of the adolescent brain offers this really unique opportunity and inclusion and belonging during this formative period can have a really outsized and positive impact. So I hope this has been informative, and thank you so much for having me, and I hope for a good discussion after. Thank you.